Welcome, Nick. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'd also like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation on whose lands I'm talking to you from today, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that greeting to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure, and it's also a real pleasure to I guess have the opportunity to both share material from the archives in an exhibition setting, and also I guess to talk about some of my favourite things. So thank you.
Awesome, thanks Nick. Well, I thought to kick us off, I thought you could let the audience into a little bit about ALGA, why it started and kind of how you got involved with the archive.
Sure. I might just share my little PowerPoint. Hopefully that's come up. So I guess, as you can see from this introductory slide, the archives was set up in 1978. The archives is an incorporated association. We're community-based and volunteer-run. We're physically based in Melbourne, but we work across Australia. We were formed, as I said, in '78 as an initiative of the 4th National Homosexual Conference, which was essentially a meeting of activists that had been going since 1975, and it was really a way for activists to come together and hash out some of the really important and key issues of the day. And in 1978, it was the focus was on work, but one of the other issues that was discussed was archives and history. And at the time, I guess, to get a bit of a sense of what it was like at the time and at that moment in history for LGBTIQ people, there was only 2 jurisdictions in Australia that had decriminalised homosexuality. Anti-discrimination legislation hadn't come into force anywhere, and I guess within that context, even though the movement itself, what was often termed the gay movement, or just the movement, it was 10 years old, but I guess that most of the cultural institutions wouldn't have been collecting material. They just, particularly material that was being produced in Australia. If you did come across something, it would likely be international literature or sexology, some kind of more medicalised material. So activists who came along to the conference wanted to get hold of, I guess, the material that had been produced by the movement over the past 10 years. And at the conference, they said, yes, let's go and do that. They made it an initiative, and with most of those who were involved coming from Melbourne, we were set up in a 4-drawer filing cabinet in the home of Graham Carberry. So this is Graham. We, rapidly expanded. We had networks, and still do, all across Australia and internationally as well. And this is actually one of our later locations. Graham actually dug out under his house and created one of our early archival spaces. So over time, we've grown quite significantly, and I guess for those people who come into contact with us today, this is perhaps a little bit more of what they will see. So we have a lot of community groups, artists, researchers, documentary filmmakers coming in and accessing material. We do our own exhibitions. For example, there's an outdoor one that we've got there in the middle. We run panels and conferences. We publish books and do history walks and stalls. So from that little 4-drawer filing cabinet, we're now over 600 shelf metres of material, covering all possible kind of aspects of queer life in Australia. So yeah, it's quite a diverse range of material, and I'll probably talk a little bit to those a bit later.
Yeah, that brings me to, I guess, I'd be interested to hear a little bit about what you view as some of the most fascinating parts of what has become a very significant collection now. What are the most prized pieces of the ALGA collection in your view?
Sure. It's really, really hard, I guess, to single anything out from a collection of a couple of 100,000 items, but I'll try. So I've just selected a small number of items to kind of talk to. So this is a page from one of a couple of scrapbooks that we have that were compiled by Monty Punchen, who was a lesbian woman who was born in 1882. So she compiled these between the 1920s and 1950s. And I guess you can see a little bit from some of these images, and you can probably see some of the story if it's clear enough. But I guess she was documenting her world from what was around at the time, and within an environment when, you know, there wasn't often the word lesbian wasn't used really in the press. You know, it would have been or sodomy or other things. What you would get was incredibly negative framings often. But she would document transgressive women who were pilots or motorbike riders, butch women, cross-dressing, and I guess passing women, as the phrase was often termed at the time. So they're really an amazing snapshot of a period in Australia's queer history, to use a broader encompassing word that's more contemporary, to document her world. And so Monty came out at 103, I believe, in 1985, and we've got some wonderful material from Monty. She used to go out on the scene in Melbourne in her very late years, and was quite a fixture in the Melbourne camp community in that later period. But she'd been involved earlier on in her life as well. So they're quite treasures. I've got four, so there's a few different things to kind of talk to. This is one of the banners in our collection. We have well over 100 banners. And I guess many people may not be familiar with an organisation called Gay Solidarity Group, but you probably would have heard of Mardi Gras, or the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras. So that initial event, the first one in 1978, was put on by the group Gay Solidarity Group. It was part of a whole day of events called the International Day of Gay Solidarity, and this banner was initially hung on the side of the truck of the first float as it went down the street in 1978. But it was heavily used subsequently by the group in the protests that followed, and right into the 80s, and I think even into the early 90s. So probably one of the most heavily used banners in Australia. So as a kind of a protest object, it's pretty significant in our collection. Okay, so this is the third item is a newsletter. So this is for DOB, stands for Daughters of Bilitis. So this was, I guess, the first gay rights and support group that had been set up in Australia by lesbians, and indeed by all, you know, using a broader framing, all gay men or women. There had been an earlier group set up in mid-1969, the Homosexual Law Reform Society of the ACT in Canberra, but this was really the first group that was formed by lesbians for lesbians, and in that broader community as well. And it was inspired by an American group, and two separate women in Melbourne had written to the American organisation, and they put them in touch with each other, and they formed this group. Very soon after, they became the Australasian Lesbian Movement, and it was relatively short lived as an organisation. It was only around for about 3 years. I guess the other thing to say about this is unique. There are no other holdings of this publication anywhere in any library or archive in Australia. And so a lot of our holdings are quite unique and are completely irreplaceable. We've digitised these and they're accessible as part of a large collection that we've just undertaken of 150 titles, about 50,000 pages, which we've digitised. Which can be accessed online. I can pass on those details, but yeah, I guess this is a real core part of our collection, is the print material. And the last item I wanted to showcase is this skinhead punk leather jacket, which was, I guess, made by a guy called Marcus Bunyan. Now, Dr. Marcus Bunyan, he's a photographer. And he moved to Australia in '85 and started work on this jacket. and you can see, I guess, a few different things about it, from the artist work on the back to the pink triangle patch on the sleeve. He'd come from Britain and had been, I guess, a punk skinhead there, and was kind of really attracted to that aesthetic. He'd come out, I guess, in the early to mid 1970s and had been involved in gay liberation then, and he's quite an active figure in terms of the photographic history and exhibitions and critique in Melbourne. So it's a really fantastic item and pretty unusual, I guess, in a museum context as well.
Amazing. Thank you for that little journey.
Sure.
I guess, you know, UNSW Galleries has on loan several items from the archive, you know, as part of Friendship as a Way of Life, including the Farrant Street House Books, which really stood out to me when I visited. I was wondering if you could explain what these items are and how they came to be in the ALGA collection.
Sure. So I've just put a couple of those scans up there. So this is a couple of pages from the house books. Many people, you know, you might be familiar with what a house book is, but some people may be a little less familiar. These house books, which date from about 87 to 92, there's a whole series. There's well over 10. They document, I guess, in quite a significant amount of detail, the shifting people who were part of a share house, a lesbian feminist share house in Adelaide. So I guess at this time, for those people who might be younger and not as familiar with a world without the internet or answering machines, these books functioned as a way to communicate between household members, to document calls and other things, messages that were coming in, to organise together as a household, to communicate concerns, and they were really a way to kind of share a communal space for people. And the pages from this particular one, you can see a whole range of issues being discussed, from protests to seminars and going out and partying. There's just a whole lot of different aspects that are covered. And I guess what's unusual about these, I mean, they're rare survivors at the best of times, I have to say, is that it really offers quite a significant snapshot. Sometimes, like, we do have some other house books, but it's usually single volumes, and they don't kind of have this volume of content that these do. Yeah, they are incredibly fascinating documents to kind of go through. There's also artwork and inserts and other things that you can see. I think for many people, the share houses were the sites of a lot of those networks of activism and friendships. Many groups were based in households. They didn't have offices or public spaces that they were able to use necessarily. And so these households were often the sites of the formation of groups, you know, holding of, you know, parties and getting ready for events, and often they're documented in books like these. So yeah, pretty exciting things, I think.
Absolutely, yes. I guess, speaking of activism, you know, the role of activist groups and doing activism collectively is a really big part of LGBTIQ history. And you in particular hold quite a large archive of some of the papers from the Order of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the work of the sisters, the prolific work of the sisters, and how their activities kind of recorded in ALGA's archive. Sure.
Well, I've put up on screen the Order of Service for Exorcism that is part of the exhibition, Friendship as a Way of Life. So this Order of Service, hopefully it's legible on screen. As far as I can tell, this is the exorcism that was conducted at the Gay Rights Embassy in 1983 in Sydney. And so the Gay Rights Embassy, I guess, was essentially, it was a caravan that different activist groups came together to, I guess, as part of the decriminalisation law reform process in New South Wales. And basically they got a caravan, planted it outside the home of the then Premier, Neville Wran. And then they ran a whole lot of events, and they had the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence running, exorcisms. They had, performances by the Gay Liberation Choir. So it was really, it was a fantastic, I think it was about 4 weeks, about a month of activism. And then the embassy was also taken on protests on the road. So the sisters, I guess, had formed in San Francisco in 1979. They were, I guess, initially it was a small group on Easter Saturday in '79, and they had some habits, traditional kind of pre-Vatican II habits of Catholic orders in black, and they went out into public. And initially the concept wasn't, I guess, what it has become in the sense of the organisation as it is now. At the time, initially it was that kind of performance, public, radical drag, and I guess the early sisters saw how impactful it was and how striking, and what they thought they could do something with it. So it quickly became, I guess, it was an order of gay male nuns, and they had some of their tenets being the expiation of stigmatic guilt, the celebration of joy, and they brought that, and they created an incredible organisation and group and network, which now spreads across the world on multiple continents, in many countries, and a huge number of houses. And there was an Australian who went across and in 1980 became a novice sister, and then when he came back to Sydney, I was on radio and connected with others, and they set up a new house, the Sydney House, and very quickly became heavily involved in activism. Many were in part of other groups, so the Gay Liberation Choir, or Gay Waves, which was a radio program on 2SER. And they became a significant fixture in Sydney, and they're still around today doing activism, perhaps not in quite so larger numbers, but they started using, I guess, in the case here of an exorcism, and repurposing that. So it was a way to kind of reinscribe the traditions of an institution, in this case the Catholic Church, to reuse those and to repurpose them for the community. So that was part of it, but it was also creating new ceremony for a community that often, and increasingly through the 80s with the advent of HIV/AIDS, needed that support, and they were able to, I guess, really present a unique approach to what's been described as serious parody, kind of forms of activism, and humour and creative reinscription of public ceremony that really shone a light on conservative Christian forces in particular. And you can see with this exorcism, for example, they kind of call out ignorance, and misinformation, political expediency, all these sorts of issues. And then in a kind of a call and response litany, which is the third page, they call for the spirit of gay liberation, multiculturalism, I'll also, the spirit of archival awareness and care of gay history, which I obviously like. Yeah. And those who are also have keen eyes, you'll notice the spirit of the dingo. And so this was, the Sydney House took the dingo as, I guess, their icon. And so you've also got at this time, I guess, Lindy Chamberlain, the Zaria case, and as I guess Australia's as, now introduced but significant native animal in in a way. It was, I guess people thought that it was, and the nuns thought that the dingo had been badly treated at the time. So the dingo kind of came on as the sisters, the Sydney sisters icon that they recognised. Yeah.
Yeah, Mother Inferior did an exorcism for this show, to open this show, as an exorcism for healing the world at this time. And one of the spirits brought in was the spirit of macrame, which I thought was very fitting.
Mother is a very, very witty nun. I've got a couple more photos also. You kind of just highlighted, I guess, the diversity of stuff, and Mother Inferior, also Mother Abyss, Monsignor Porca Madonna, Sister Mary Venus de Lilo, many facets of the wonderful person that is Mother Inferior and Fabian. So these are more items from Fabian's papers. And you can see here, I guess, different aspects of the sisters in Sydney. So the main, or the image to the lower left, which has been used to promote this in conversation, which is mostly me rabbiting on for a very long time, is an image of a rally in Sydney for abortion law reform in 1991. So the sisters were very often, I guess, could be seen as doing solidarity activism at a whole range of events, or in terms of what their concerns were as the order in Sydney, out in public. But on the right, you see a little flyer, or at least the artwork for the flyer, for vows of profession and taking the habit for some new sisters. And you kind of see a few other references there. The Convent of the Seven Leaps Forward. So this was a communal share house where one of the founding sisters lived, and in Rozelle. And so this was some of the private humorous ceremonies that were undertaken and celebrations within the order. And then in the upper left, you've got a wedding. And so weddings and blessings were a really significant part and role of what the sisters were doing. So that was really for community and for the broader, I guess, queer community. So they really did a whole range of things, and Fabian's papers extend quite beyond this as well. So yeah.
Absolutely. So we've also got on loan from ALGA there's 28 issues of the Australian lesbian porn mag Wicked Women. I would love for you to just talk through a little bit about what's the significance of this publication and the kind of impact that it had in Australia.
Sure. So Wicked Women, I guess, was a magazine of erotica. So in the sense that it had erotic stories, poetry, photography, but it was also, I guess, a celebration of sex positivity. So it had been set up in '87, more as a zine, set up in Sydney by Francine Leibert and Lisa Salmon. And progressively became more like a magazine over time, and you've got this wonderful issue here, I think from '92. And on the cover is Maud Davey, and Maud was the second Miss Wicked, I think, second or third. So the Miss Wicked competitions, and you see on the lower right, some flyers from those, were an event which was somewhat modelled on, I guess, the leather competitions, the Mr Drummer International Mr Leather, which were run in Australia, and were a significant part of the gay male scene. And there wasn't really anything equivalent. And I guess before Wicked Women had come onto the scene, there had been some small groups, I guess, groups like Sexually Outrageous Women, SOW, in Sydney, who would run sauna nights, and there was other things, but really it was with Wicked Women and the events that they ran, the parties, which weren't just Miss Wicked, there were other parties as well, and the competition, that you really saw this flowering of, I guess, lesbian sex positive community, and also, I guess, a greater integration between the gay male community and the lesbian community. And I think in many ways, Wicked Women really pioneered the early queer community. When queer was really becoming an impact in Sydney and internationally, in more so in the early 90s, Wicked Women was creating that environment, that kind of shared space for gay men and lesbians in a really positive, sex positive and engaging space. For much of the preceding 20 years, the communities, at least as they were defined, lesbian and gay, were somewhat separate in different ways. I mean, they definitely came together in events like the Mardi Gras and the party, the after party, but it was really only, I think, more so with something like this, even though it was still very much women focused, that it was really creating a new space. And so it was a pretty exciting publication. It definitely had a pushback in the way that I guess earlier on with the sex wars in America, and it was in the same way. Wicked Women was modelled on the publication in America called On Our Backs, which itself was a response to a British feminist publication called Off Our Backs. So it was very much cast in that mould, but it did a whole lot of more in a way, I think, in terms of, particularly in the Sydney community, but the events also ran in Brisbane and in Melbourne as well. So, yeah.
I guess what drew, when trying to think of what objects from ALGA to include in an exhibition about queer kinship and forms of being together, it was really difficult to pinpoint which ones, because it's, there's so much. And I guess these particular examples that you've just walked us through, the Farrant House, the Order, Wicked Women, they all kind of demonstrate quite clearly this kind of queer collectivism happening historically in Australia.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like working together to get stuff done, or to have representation and things like that. I guess I was interested to hear you speak a little bit about specifically collectivism, the role of collectivism in LGBTIQ history in Australia. Sure.
I guess for me, I mean, so much of our community is based on collective structures. We might not use that terminology as much anymore, but what I think it goes back to is a history of organising which necessitated communal structures, and also that it comes from a lineage that directly relates to women's liberation and the liberation movements. At the time, I guess, when gay liberation was established in Australia, there was very, very few existing gay groups. Gay Liberation in Australia formed initially in Sydney, and it formed as a cell within a group called Campaign Against Moral Persecution. They had both had different forms of activism and had done protests and others, but I guess at the time they were still drawing on those women's liberation aspects of collective models around decision making to some extent, but also things like consciousness raising and other forms of coming together and raising awareness of issues and creating those structures to ensure that those groups were going to continue. It's also, a lot of the parties and social scene which developed at that time was used to fund back into those organisations. The funding and structures for these groups weren't readily apparent. There's no government funding, certainly in that 1970s period. You really don't see funding for organisations even just start really until the 1980s. And so even then it was quite piecemeal, and even now it's quite piecemeal. So these community organisations have to do it themselves, and so that DIY ethic and creating those structures are incredibly important. I think even in the current context of when you do have definitely more support, you've got initiatives like, say, the Victorian Pride Centre, or you get regular funding for Mardi Gras, for major events. The vast majority of queer community organisations in Australia don't don't receive any funding. And if they do, it's from their members and it's from that broader public. It's still doing fundraisers. So, you know, it may be those parties and those dance parties or those drag queens or whoever are doing that work to ensure that these organisations are sustained. And obviously the work of the volunteers who come together themselves. You know, I think many of us do try within the organisations that we're involved in to create structures different from, you know, heteropatriarchal, you know, models and norms. We're not always successful, but we try. And, you know, I think we, you know, build on those forms that have come before us, and also realise that we, you know, don't all want to be stuck in a 2-hour Zoom meeting to try to resolve, you know, tiny little issues to do with governance. But, you know, that's contemporary.
The highs and lows of collectivism. I want to bring you now to kind of thinking more contemporaneously. Do you kind of see, you know, within the queer scene in Australia, a kind of clear lineage of this kind of collective activity that we've kind of walked, you've walked us through? Any particular examples, like, you know, post the sisters, or, you know, that you could kind of bring?
I guess, you know, the sisters I do find somewhat unique in the way that they created their forms of activism were heavily informed by the rituals and the intricacies of the church. And there was, you know, strains of anarchism and all these other things within the sisters, which I find really interesting, and also that parody and humour. I see those strains in terms of the form of activism, certainly with people like, say, Pauline Pantsdown, as a digital activist these days, but, you know, formally in terms of more of a physical presence, as well as the music as well. I would see activists like, say, Ethel Yarwood, who does floats in Mardi Gras and other protests around that are quite humorous and creative. The Turn Back the Floats float was a really fantastic one, but so many others as well. I think in a broader sense, there's perhaps less sustained humour, maybe, in some of our approach to activism these days. But I mean, there's still wonderful little, maybe less sustained in broader organisations, but, you know, groups like Frocks Against Fracking up in the Northern Rivers. Or, you know, different groups associated with Extinction Rebellion and the kind of street theatre of the Red Brigade. I think there's those aspects which are really wonderful to see in the way that they bring humour to try to cut through some of the discourse and to inform. And also that some of the forms of activism are online and in different spaces than we might be used to. I think perhaps also in terms of the collective, you know, look, there are so many wonderful groups that are being formed and, you know, online in different spaces. And I'd say particularly around trans and intersex groups that are forming. I think there's wonderful, you know, you can create communities in digital spaces that can come together that, you know, it's much harder to connect physically in many ways these days. And so not just during pandemic and isolation, but also, you know, it could be in, say, furry communities or different fetish communities. You know, there's a lot of those things that are coming together. And, you know, that is pretty exciting. I would certainly love to see more of the sisters every day. But, you know, definitely, you know, I think it's important to know and to be aware of those roots and the different ways that we can engage in activism to kind of impact our struggles.
Turning now to, I guess, the next generation, or the younger than me, younger generation.
Sure.
ALGA certainly plays a role, as you know, you've demonstrated in this talk. It plays a role in shaping and informing our understanding of Australian LGBTIQ history. What do you see as like the future of ALGA in being able to record a kind of contemporary queer culture, particularly if, as you say, a lot of it is maybe more discreet or more online, maybe not as on the streets, let's say, and ensuring that the past isn't, the only thing that is recorded really well, but also lives on in the archives in a current sense.
Sure. I have, Mike, can I bring up the next slide? Excellent. Okay, so I guess we do a lot of contemporary collecting or quick response collecting. It's a really big part of what we do. And we have wonderful volunteers around Australia and members who respond to call outs and who are out collecting material. So, for example, on the top left, you can see just some of the material we collected and that was donated by so many wonderful people through marriage equality. So we were doing that on a kind of active basis and still very much collecting in that space to try and get really diverse responses, and also seeing, I guess, what's missing out in different ways. So, looking at particularly Chinese Australian experience and looking at regional experience and others. So we were getting material from Alice Springs to Darwin, Hobart, lots of different places, as well as non-metropolitan areas as well. On the bottom left is a fundraiser for a charity from London, and that was promoted in Australia as well, and we were able to get some posters from that. But often, people are sending material all the time. The top right is the very newly published volume from, I think, UTS, and it's a kind of a compilation of writing from students. But we're doing different things and trying to, obviously people are, queer communities are creating material in lots of different ways. And so we're also looking at things like TikTok, which we haven't collected before, and different forms of online streaming and more digital collecting. It raises a whole lot of really interesting issues for an archive and for access and republishing and exhibitions and things, but it's a really exciting thing as well. And, that's been a particular thing that we're looking at in the context of isolation and pandemic response. But it's also looking at the ways that we can do some things that maybe we already do, but slightly differently. So we do oral history interviews, and historically they've largely been life story interviews and often towards the end of life. I think, we're starting to also look at more younger people and trying to get more immediate experiences from particular incidents. So, I've recorded interviews with a wonderful young couple who went through surrogacy in their 30s, through to just a whole range of different interviews as well. And I think part of what we need to do is look at different ways that we can capture, and maybe that's more thematic or more on the spot and responsive. But it's also getting ourselves out there in different ways. So many people, if they come across us these days, it's on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and it's being able to both, part of that is collecting, but it's also about promoting and sharing material and telling those histories as well. So part of our remit is also about celebration. So we're in the process of going to be moving to the Pride Centre, the Victorian Pride Centre, which is currently being constructed. And so this will give us a significantly more public space than we've had in many of our previous iterations at our homes. So it will be in St Kilda, and we'll have, I guess, a greater public space there, a greater, more of our collection on site, or the vast majority. We'll be able to do exhibitions and events. So that's a really exciting thing for us to get more material out there and hopefully connect with more people as well. But, we're still all volunteer, and, we, I guess, try to do as much as we can with, I guess, a fairly smallish group. And also, we're entirely funded by our members. So being an incorporated association, although we sometimes get some grants for one-off projects, we're still funded by our members, and you should become a member if you're not out there. It's $5 for students and low income per year, or $20 otherwise, and you're very welcome to give donations above that. And so that, membership also comes with newsletters and more information and different things as well. So please consider. Hint, hint.
Thanks, Nick. Yes, I agree. Everyone should become a member. I wholly support that. Such a fantastic and important organisation. Thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you for such great questions and allowing me to talk and talk and talk and talk. My apologies if I ranted on too much.
I can see that there is some questions, so I'll hand over to Julia. Do you want to, you're going to moderate some questions, Julia?
Yeah, I'll just read them out. There's quite a few, and some of it I think you covered, like questions were coming throughout the discussion, so you might have covered some answers already. But the first one is, how can the community support or assist the ALGA activities?
Oh, well, I would definitely say, becoming a member is really great. I think because it does connect you more with what we do. But look, if you're not already or if you haven't liked us on Facebook, we try and put out quite a bit of content there on our page. We've also got a Facebook group where a lot of people share that sort of information share different information about history, queer history in Australia and internationally. And on Twitter. So that's a great way just to find out more about what's going on and events and more about our collection. People are often think that their own lives are not something that's I guess something that should be of interest to others, but everyday lives are really important, and the experiences that we have are incredibly important. So what I would say is that, look, if you've got a little box that might have, flyers of parties or photos of friends or, love letters even, don't think that they might not be of interest to other people at different points, and that your experiences are actually unique and valuable to history. So please consider keeping them. And if you are interested in preservation or anything like that, just drop us an email and we can give you some advice around that as well. And just if you want to find out more generally about queer history in Australia, we have some wonderful publications for sale on our website, and there is of course the wonderful queer bookshops in Sydney and Melbourne, the Bookshop Darlinghurst and Hares and Hyenas, which are amazing centres for queer history.
Thank you, amazing. The next one I think you've covered in quite a lot of detail, but just if there's anything else you can think of. The question is, can you please tell us how you acquire items for the collection? Are they all donations? Are there specific items you might secure through auctions or estate sales?
Sure. Look, the vast majority of things in our collection have been received as donations. When material gets donated, we generally go through a process around, particularly if it's unpublished material, so things like photos or letters or anything, records of organisations. We'll work through with the donor any concerns that they might have, any restrictions or other things like that, how we document it, and we might also do an oral history interview to capture additional aspects of their memories in relation to an organisation or some material that they've donated. So we go through that process with them as well. We don't often purchase material, which is partly because we just don't have much money. Hint, hint, donate. But I think, look, there is also not often a lot of material that goes to sale in Australia unless people are quite significant figures. So, notable academics or writers, sometimes the material will come up. But often it's, sometimes they'll donate material to, I guess, the more mainstream institutions. So that's another way. Occasionally material does come up. So, the effects, or, it might be a sign from a business. So yeah, things do come up in that sense. But I would say if people they are interested in donating material, or if they'd like to find out more, just send us an email or a message on Facebook. And if you're not already across what our contact details are, our website is www.alga.org.au. You might find a very old website, but that is currently being redeveloped. Check back soon. Or our Facebook page. And you can just look up ALGA on Facebook and you'll find us.
Yes, I can see in the comments people have already signed up to the Facebook page, which is very good. The next question, are there any significant gaps that you're aware of that ALGA is missing? Just thinking, this is still in the question, just thinking about how we might promote donations of material, especially when many people holding odd little collections of ephemera without realising its significance for archives.
Sure. Look, we have such a vast queer past. And by queer, I mean in its very broadest sense: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, asexual, brother, boy, sister, girl. I guess what is hardest to get often is really the material pre-1970. So we have wonderful material, and I mentioned that scrapbook, but prior to that period, material was so often destroyed by individuals, self-censored particularly, but also by families. And we've even been left material by people in their wills, and their family has come in and destroyed it. So I would say that if you do have material that you think is of importance, please try to deal with it prior to your death, because it is much harder to control those things afterwards. So it's really good to get some of that stuff in order. And also, I guess, if people are thinking about their own archiving, you will know your material better than anybody else. So, we'll often be left with photos, and we don't know who is in that photo. And one of my favourite collections at the archives that I probably should have put up as well is a collection of photos. It's 2,500 photos documenting someone's life from the late 40s to the 2000s, and so it covers drag and camp balls, particularly in the 50s to 1970s. But a significant number of those people are not identified, but it is still incredibly rich. So definitely do that. Certainly, in terms of other areas, I would say regional and rural material relating to experience in country towns is often quite hard to locate. We're involved with a number of projects around trans life in Australia. So there's a multi-year Australian Research Council project currently underway around transgender history in Australia. And so we have quite a few very important transgender collections, and there's more being received through that. But, that's definitely a kind of a growing area in terms of research in Australia. So always looking in that. But I could go on, 600 metres, there's only so many stories.
Fantastic. And this is our last question. Curious to hear about your work at NFSA, and if your work at ALGA has enabled you to help the National Archive with archiving LGBT audiovisual history.
Great question. It is really interesting to work between, I guess, community settings and institutional ones. And over my entire professional career, working within cultural institutions, there's always been ways to do that work to enhance the work that I'm doing. Sometimes it's a bit more surreptitious. So I've certainly had comments about being a bit focusing perhaps a little bit too much on queer issues, and I'm interested in much more than queer and trans issues. But I think increasingly over that time, the institutions that I've been involved with professionally have become more aware and more concerned about representation and diversity, and increasingly they've really valued my experience around queer histories, even if I'm focusing on something else. So at the moment, I'm working at the National Film and Sound Archive. they have been incredibly supportive. I have, for example, well, I'm not sure if I can announce it because it hasn't actually been put up, but working on a curator's pick to do a screening of a film which is on trans history in Australia, and it's a film that hadn't been seen since it was exhibited very briefly for 2 weeks in the early 1980s. So I guess I was able to recognise the significance of the item and to be able to also connect with my personal networks into communities to try and draw that experience into a screening, which will happen towards the end of this year. And so there's other events like that where I can also look at material that's in the collection and enhance records. And so having worked on collections at the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives that touch on aspects, particularly say radio, and I know the individuals who are involved. So it's been really helpful, and thankfully work has been very supportive.
That's fantastic. Great to see that there's a lot of crossover. That is the last of the questions, but there's lots more comments saying how much everyone appreciates your work with ALGA and the organisation itself. I just want to say thank you for joining us today and for sharing your experiences and some of your favourite parts of the collection. It's been just fantastic to hear more.
Oh, look, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about the collection of the Lesbian and Gay Archives. It is such a phenomenal collection. I'd also like to really give a shout out to my fellow volunteers and committee members at the archives. Being an all-volunteer organisation for 42 years is no small feat, and it is only because we have such a wonderful group of people who would volunteer with us. You know, I pay homage to all of those volunteers who've gone before me as well. So yes, please get involved if you are interested, and if you do want any more information than I've given, which is probably way too much for many people, please email us as well, and I'd be more than happy to answer on the other end.